But tonight we're fortunate we have her here to speak to us. My dear friend and a wonderful patriot, Krisanne.
She always makes me cry. I was sort of trying to distract myself when she was doing the introduction so I wouldn't cry. I was looking for my husband. Is he still in here? No, he skipped out on me. He's heard this one before. I'm just teasing. Well, I want to thank St. Bernard's for bringing me in. I want to thank Catholics for Freedom of Religion for being such an important part of the preservation of liberty. Barbara, she says she wants to be like me when she grows up, but I could not keep up with her all the time. She took it easy on me this time. In the days that I've been here, I've only taught 3 classes and done 1 television interview. That's usually 1 day with Barbara. But it's important for us to be active. We have been sedentary for too long. We have become complacent and compliant with the destruction of our own liberty. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with just ignorance. I want to mention to you, we need to take back some of our language. Ignorance is not a derogatory term. It's not the same as stupid. Ignorance just means we have failed to obtain the proper knowledge. We don't have what we need to defend liberty. Case in point, the Supreme Court is going to be asking the question, is marriage a constitutional issue? Now that should be a no-brainer, because it's really very clear, even on quick glance, that marriage is not in the Constitution. It's not even implied in the Constitution, other than to understand that marriage is a power that was to be reserved to the states. See, if it's not expressly enumerated in the Constitution, then it's a power that does not belong to the federal government. But because we have failed to teach the Constitution for very long, and we've failed to teach our judges and lawyers what our Constitution really means, we're actually putting liberty in jeopardy. And a lot of that, I believe, may be challenging, may be hard to hear, is going to fall at the feet of our churches. Let me ask you a question. How many of you believe that liberty is a gift from God? How many of you believe that America was established in the very least through divine providence? The Bible teaches, to whom much is given, much is required. The parable of the talents teaches that when the master gives a gift, he expects the servants to not simply bury that gift in the sand, but to prosper it. We've all just admitted that liberty is a gift from God. And so we must ask ourselves, what are we doing to prosper it? I'll remind you, in that parable of the talents, there were 3 servants mentioned. One who was given 5, another given, I forgot, 2, thank you, and then another given 1. The servant who had been given 5 said, "Here, you master, here are the 5 that you gave me, and 5 more." The one given 2 said, "Here, master, here's the 2 that you've given me, and here are 2 more." The one that was given 1 talent said, "I knew you were a hard man, where you did not reap, where you reaped, where you did not sow. And so I buried my talent in the sand. Here is the talent that you've given me." You see, That parable teaches us that when the master gives a gift, there will be a day of reckoning. He will return, and you will have to answer for the things that he's given you. But if you stand before the master and say, look, these are the gifts that you've given me, and I have worked through my life, through your absence, to prosper these gifts, what is it that the master says in return? Well done, thou good and faithful servant. I've placed you over a few things, now be master over many. But the one servant who took his talent and hid it in the sand, he said to the master, I was too afraid to prosper the gift that you've given me. So I'm not going to give it back to you in the same manner it was presented to me. Do you know what that servant is telling his master? I didn't trust your power to protect me while you were gone. I had no faith that I would be guarded in my action in your name. And because I was too afraid to do what you expected me to do, because I did not have the faith in the power of who you were, that I simply buried the gift that you gave me in fear. And now I'm going to give it back to you. And what did the master say? Wicked, slothful servant. God has given us a gift of liberty. What have we done with it? Have we declared that we are too afraid to defend our liberties? Have we lost our faith in God, that even though he's not standing right in front of us, that he has the power to protect and defend us when we work in his name? Because that's what he tells us. Lo, I will never leave you or forsake you. I am with you always. The Bible says, if God is for us, who can be against us? And it's replete with stories of men and women who stood in the name of the Lord and were victorious, even without the physical presence of God in front of them. Have we become that fearful servant? That one of little faith? I think that we have. But I think that we have because of ignorance. See, in order to take a stand for liberty, you have to be able to define it. If you can't define liberty, you cannot defend it. And because we don't know where our liberties come from anymore, we can actually have open public debates on whether our rights come from God or come from some document invented by men. We don't understand what the nature of our liberty really is. And we even have a hard time identifying them on an individual basis. For example, I'll give you a little pop quiz. The First Amendment is what we're here to talk about today. Specifically, the religious liberty aspect of the First Amendment. But there are more than just religious liberty in the First Amendment. There are actually 5 liberties in the First Amendment. To yourself, not out loud, I want you to name all 5. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took a poll and found out that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. Now, I don't know where you fall in that statistic. It's none of my business. But I asked you that question so I could ask you this one. If you do not know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? And if you don't know what they are, how will you have the courage to defend them? You can't. Because if you don't know what they are, that means you're not exercising them. And if you're not exercising your rights, they're already gone. What good is freedom of speech if you never say anything controversial? We don't have a reminder of our inherent right to speak freely, to protect popular speech. Popular speech needs no protection. It's the ones that challenge. It's the ones that offend. So we want to start really exercising our rights. We want to really start defending our liberty. We should make it a point every single day to stand up in public and say something unpopular. It's a little bit easier for some of us than others, right, Ms. Garland? But in this day of age, what exactly is unpopular?
Merry Christmas.
Okay, but that's a really good example, because you and I could speak of our faith in public and challenge and offend people, but we won't, will we? Because we're afraid. Because we don't understand how necessary this is. We lack the proper education, and without the proper education, we lack the courage to stand. Our liberty was not a gift to us from our founders. It was not an invention of our framers. Thomas Jefferson did not invent separation of church and state, which, by the way, is the foundational principle of religious liberty. All of that inherited. Our framers knew what liberties needed to be protected, because they knew their history. They knew that their forefathers had been fighting for centuries, with government wanting to always take the liberty of the people, to enslave them, to bind them, to make them subjects. And their forefathers always fighting against this continual tug of war between government power and people's liberty. Because every time the government gathers more power to itself, that means less liberty for the people. Liberty and government are enemies. And anybody that would suggest to you that the government can achieve some type of balance between their power and your liberty is either ignorant or lying to you. Because that's not possible. Because government power is a ravenous wolf that will always consume your liberty. The more power government has, the less liberty you have. And our framers knew that, not because they woke up with some epiphany one day, but because they saw their forefathers fight for over 700 years. Our religious liberty, like I said, was not birthed by Thomas Jefferson. As a matter of fact, if you look through the history of our Constitution, you can find it way back, but in specifically being first codified, written down, by a king named Henry I in 1100. Henry I is going to make a promise to the Anglo-Saxons that government would never be evil and oppressive again. How's that one working out for us? Henry says, look, if you don't chop off my head, I'll make a document that promises you that government will never be evil and oppressive again. And one of the very first things that he promises doesn't even make it to a list of 14 things that the government is not supposed to do. The very first thing that he promises is that the church will be completely free from government intrusion. How is it that a king in 1100 with no internet, no cell phones, no CNN, no MSNBC or Fox News knew that if the government is in your church in the very smallest aspect, that is an evil and oppressive government? And today we simply call that what? 501c3. Well, in 100 years, the Anglo-Saxons are going to look back at this 1100 Charter of Liberty and be grateful that they have it. Because in 100 years, past Henry I, the Anglo-Saxons are going to have the most evil and oppressive king they will ever know. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king, and if you can't pay your taxes in John's kingdom, which is highly likely, you are arrested. You are thrown into prison. You are mutilated. He's going to cut off hands, feet, ears, cut the tongues out of people who cannot afford to pay their taxes. He's even executing them. The people called him ruthless and vicious. One man said, even hell was fouled by the presence of John. That makes him a pretty bad guy. You guys know John, by the way. You probably don't realize it. How many of you heard of a man named Robin Hood? That's the king in the Robin Hood stories. How many of you realize we are not teaching proper history to our young people? Our history has been revised, been rewritten, has been altered to suit whoever is in power. Well, not only are we in the business of altering history, but we're also revising legend. Because we haven't been told the truth about Robin Hood either. What do we popularly teach about Robin Hood? Why is he famous?
Steal from the rich.
Rob from the rich and give to the poor. Only that's not true. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation and returning it to the people so they could live. Remember, John is going to murder you if you cannot pay your taxes. Robin Hood is not trying to put everybody on equal financial footing. He's giving people their lives back. He is not a socialist. He's a liberty fighter. Because the first step to liberty is always a right to life. Because if you don't have the right to live, what other rights do you get? Now, something interesting happens and a rebellion forms against John. Not over his taxation, but over his interference with the church. The people choose a man by the name of Stephen Langton to be their archbishop, the head of their church. John steps up and says, I don't like this guy. I'm going to pick who the head of your church is going to be. But you see, John's already forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties that says the church will be completely free from government intrusion. And a rebellion forms against John. And we get another document that preserves our liberty. You know, there's actually, in the history of our Constitution, 5 of these documents. Our framers called them liberty charters. I call them the genealogy of our Constitution because we have a genealogy, we have a family tree. And if someone went back in time and murdered my great-great-grandfather, I wouldn't be here. Any one of these 5 documents missing through 700 years of history, our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights would not exist if just one of them were missing. And if they did, they would probably look completely different, and quite likely, we would be a kingdom and not a constitutional republic. A rebellion forms against John, bringing us the second of these liberty charters. This one's called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is an amazing document. It's not a promise from the king like the 1100 Charter of Liberties, but a demand from the people that government will not be evil and oppressive. The Magna Carta reads, in the first place, we have granted to God, and by this our present charter, confirmed for us and our heirs forever, that the English church shall be free, and shall have her rights entire, and her liberties inviolate. Once again declaring that the church is to be completely free from government intrusion. John is going to sign the Magna Carta because he has a sword at his throat, and the people will remove him from the throne less than a year later. But the Magna Carta is an amazing document. It is a demand by the people that government keeps their promise. It says, hey, you made us a promise that the governments would no longer be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise. So now we, the people, are going to rise and king and tell the king what he can and cannot do. How many of you think kings being told what to do by people is going to go over well? It's not. For 400 years now, the Anglo-Saxons are going to engage in that struggle for liberty and power, with kings who want to destroy their liberty and people trying to preserve it. Fast forwarding to 1625, we have a king named Charles I. Charles I is described as being a massive spending king. They say Charles loves to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. See, it's not new that we pay for their vacations. But whose money is Charles spending? The people's money. How is he collecting their money? Taxes. Well, you see, the Magna Carta has established a royal council that has control over the king. 25 men who sit in this king's court and tell the king what he can and cannot do. And in Charles' day, that royal council is now called Parliament. And Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending, stands up to Charles and says, we're not passing any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. Imagine that. They looked at the king and said, we're going to defund your activity until you get a proper budget. Now Charles doesn't care about the people, and he dissolves Parliament. He keeps collecting their taxes through unlawful decree. He says, don't worry, I'm not really breaking the law. I'm not really violating your liberty, because you see, the money I'm collecting from you is not a tax. It's a mandate. There's a difference, you know.
Not according to the Supreme Court.
A rebellion forms against Charles, which brings us the third document in our genealogy. This one's called the Petition of Right of 1628. This amazing document outlining the liberties of the people and the limited nature of their government declares in its preamble that liberty is the inherent possession of men and not the gifts of government. Imagine that. Here we are in 2015, having the same debate with Chris Cuomo. Apparently, the people of 1628 were smarter than Mr. Cuomo. Charles is going to sign the Petition of Right because he has a sword in his throat. But the people are not going to remove him from the throne. Perhaps they thought Charles has learned a lesson. How do you think that's going to work out for them? Now remember, the Magna Carta says that the church will be free from government intrusion, will have their rights and liberties inviolate. The 1100 Charter of Liberties demanded that the church would be completely free from government intrusion. And what do you suppose Charles is going to start doing? Now our people, our forefathers knew that liberty was an inherent gift. And so I want to introduce you to a woman by the name of Jenny Geddes. Jenny Geddes lives in Scotland at the time of Charles I's reign, just after the Petition of Right. Jenny Geddes gets so sick and tired of hearing the government's mandated speech from her pulpit that she stands up in church one day and throws her stool at the pastor while he's preaching, yelling things about puppets and tools of the government, not men of God. That ruckus rolls out into the streets and spreads throughout the kingdom. In the name of religious liberty, we have a whole new battle going on in the kingdom called the Bishop Wars. Charles is paying as little mind to him as he wants to. He's trying to figure out how to spend the people's money without them noticing. So he says to the people, I want to show you something. Do you see that over there? You see, right now we live in very violent times, Charles says. There are wars everywhere. And I want you to look over there because our friends are fighting in all these wars in their land. Can I ask you a very important question? Do you want those wars to come to our kingdom? Well, of course I don't want those wars to come to our kingdom. Nobody wants war here. Well, I got good news for you. I've got the perfect plan. I know how to keep those wars from ever coming here. See, all you have to do is give me your tax dollars, and I will make sure all our allies are adequately funded in all these foreign wars. And if they're adequately funded over there, that means that they will be superior in power, superior in strength, and they will win those wars over there. If they win over there, they'll end over there, they'll never come to our kingdom. See, I told you it was perfect. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is give me your tax dollars. Because you see, it's a matter of national security that you pay your taxes. But 1628 was a big year, and the people are watching Charles very closely. And they're noticing Charles is lying to them. See, Charles is not funding their allies like he's promised. Charles is funding their enemies. Because he's made a promise to the enemies. I help you win over there. You come over here and help me get my people back under subjection. We got to get rid of this Jenny Geddes woman. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty and sentenced to death. A process that brings us our fourth Liberty Charter. This one's called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. The Grand Remonstrance says the root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom. So what does that mean in modern English? Basically, it means we've been watching tyrannical government for 600 years now, and we're noticing a pattern. The same bag of tricks over and over again. And when you read the Grand Remonstrance, you see that design: corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, the government diminishing the property rights of the people, the government taking control of the church, the government creating fiat money to control the monetary system, and the government disarming the people while the government remains armed. And in 1641, they called that a wicked, evil plan whose only purpose is to overturn and undermine liberty. And 40 years later, we have a brand new king, same old design. This time the king's name is James II, and James finds himself to be a very good man, he thinks, a really great king, and he's going to stand before the people and give them something he says they've never had before. I'm going to give you something so great you'll know how great I am. And he issues a decree that says you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, anytime you want, with any pastor you want. You can preach anything you want on one condition. Before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said. And you must promise that you will never, ever, ever say anything bad about the king in church. That doesn't sound like religious liberty to me. That sounds like a 501c3. So what's the difference between 1688 and 2015? In 1688, the bishops stood up to the government and said, "We will not follow your decree because a law that violates our liberty is no law at all." See, we're not doing anything wrong. We're not breaking the law. It is the government that is breaking a higher law. And when government violates a higher law, their laws are no laws at all. A rebellion forms against James, bringing us the fifth document in our genealogy. This one's called the English Bill of Rights. Whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and religion and liberties of our people. Standing up in the name of liberty, tyrannical government. And our framers knew that standing was what we had to do. So when George III comes along, because at this point you're probably thinking, well, Krisanne, you keep talking about the Anglo-Saxons and all this British history. I mean, after all, we're the melting pot. What do we care about British history? Well, as a people, we are. But as a law, we are not. Our Constitution comes from British law. Because the colonies were owned by the British government. And everyone who lived in the American colonies was subject to British law. And if you made the American colonies your home, you were subjects to the Crown of Great Britain. And so this is the law that our Constitution was developed from. This is the liberty history that our framers learned from. There's also another bit of history that we need to re-educate ourselves on because we've been a little bit misinformed. We have been taught in our schools that the Pilgrims came to America, the New World at that time, searching for religious liberty. Remember being taught that? Only that's not true. They didn't come here looking for religious liberty. They came here fleeing religious persecution. There's a difference. And the difference is evidenced by what they did when they got here. Because when they got here, they set up charters. They are governments. They didn't set up charters based on religious liberty. They set up charters based on government-mandated religion. Now, in their minds, just realize they haven't come to the point of our framers in realizing these lessons of liberty. And in their mind, they're fleeing religious persecution from their government. So what's the best way to keep the government from persecuting for you for your beliefs? Make sure the government believes the same thing you do. Problem is, they did everything that they could to ensure that would not change. Because you see, you know, and they had to know as well, that government always changes perspectives, right? Depending on who is elected. So they created these things called test acts. These test acts were oaths of office that said you couldn't run for office in our government unless you took an oath of loyalty to the religion of that charter. Because we all know people don't break oaths, right? But I want to suggest to you, perhaps, that people can take an oath they don't have any intentions of keeping, not because they're evil, but because they've justified it for good ends. Think about this. You're fleeing religious persecution. You're fleeing. It's not like you're buying a plane ticket for you and your family, picking which airport you're going to leave from in London, and then picking which airport you're going to land in the New World. No. When you flee religious persecution, you are literally bankrupting yourself to buy a ticket for you and your family to get on a boat. You are praying that you survive the journey because many people will not. And when you get to the New World, you get where you get. How many of you remember learning that the Mayflower didn't land where it was supposed to? Such is the nature of sin. And so what happens if you've gone through all this and your only thought is, land, I've lived, praise God, but then you land in a charter that's not your religion? Now you're bankrupt. You're going to have to stay in that charter until you can amass the resources to move on with your family to a charter that is your religion, if such a creature exists. And in the meantime, what are you going to do? Are you going to stop practicing your religion because it's against the law? Or are you going to simply declare that that law is violating a higher law, a freedom of conscience that God has given us? And say, I will not obey that law, I will worship according to the dictates of my conscience. Because I have to answer to God for that one day. Well, if you choose to worship according to the dictates of your conscience, you have to be prepared for the consequences. Because this is not a friendly suggestion. If the government finds you practicing a religion outside the government-mandated religion, you will be fined. You will be arrested. You will be thrown into prison. You will be beaten, tortured, tarred, feathered, and possibly even executed. I'm not talking about Iraq. And I'm not talking about China. I'm talking about right here on this soil, as we were just beginning. I don't know if you remember this from your history lesson, but Massachusetts had a law that said if any shipment were to import a Quaker into Massachusetts, the shipment would be thrown into prison and the Quaker would be hung. And that's what government-mandated religion gives you. Nothing but tyranny. So couldn't you justify taking an oath that you didn't believe in order to get into government to change the religion so you wouldn't have to see your people persecuted like this? You could do that, right? And now all of a sudden, the people who created the government-mandated religion, the sword that they put in the hand of government is not their government anymore. And the sword that they put in the hand of government to protect them will become the sword that persecutes them. That's why government-mandated religion and religious liberty are not the same thing. Because whenever you give the government power to dictate conscience, the only result is tyranny. And our framers knew that. As a matter of fact, religious liberty was a hotly contested thing in our constitutional debate. The state of Virginia, being led by a group called the Virginia Baptist General Convention, was refusing to ratify the Constitution. Now, the Virginia Baptist General Convention had suffered this early persecution in these colonies, had seen their people beaten and tarred and feathered and executed. And they said, look, we don't want to sign up for a union that will possibly enter us into a repetition of that history. And we would rather take our chances on our own against foreign governments than to yoke up with a union that will eventually oppress us. So we want to have greater protection of religious liberty while we can get it. Now, the leader of the Virginia Baptist General Convention was a man named John Leland. Virginia wanted Leland to be a delegate for the state of Virginia on behalf of the state of Virginia to the Constitutional Convention. But Leland did not want that job. So Leland met with one of his opponents. Now, Leland had the backing of the Virginia Baptist General Convention. They were the political power in Virginia. So he knew he was going to be the delegate. But he went to his opponent and he said, look, I don't want this, you do. I will back out of this race and I will endorse you on one condition. You must promise the people of this state that you will do everything humanly and superhumanly possible to ensure the greater protections of religious liberty. And on a handshake, an agreement, the history of the world changed. Because I'm pretty sure most of you have never heard of John Leland. But I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of his opponent, James Madison. James Madison made a promise to the people of Virginia that we would have greater protections of religious liberty, that we would not get into a union that could possibly become a place where we would have the government with the sword to determine what we can and cannot believe. Jefferson said, we never submitted our conscience to the government. That is not something that we can submit to, because we must answer to God for it. That is the basic principle, the driving principle for who we are as a people in America. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That principle of understanding that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with these rights tells us, look, we have an obligation to our Creator because He is the giver of our liberty. So what do? We have to fix some things. But let me tell you what, the fixes will not be easy. We have a lot of training to overcome. We have to correct the way we talk about things. The ladies told you, this is not freedom of worship, this is freedom of religion. Why? Because words matter. Language matters. And I want to challenge you to change the way you speak so that we can be focused on a victory in liberty. And the first thing that I want us to correct is this speech where we call ourselves a Christian nation. We are not a Christian nation. We were never supposed to be a Christian nation. We were supposed to be a union of states built on a principle of religious liberty. Religious liberty and Christian nation do not work together. Because a Christian nation establishes that Christians have a supremacy. That are possibly even supported by the government. And when the government has the power to support your religion, it has the power to persecute your religion. So what we need to do is realize that although we are not a Christian nation, because we do not have a government that can support a religion, we do not require people to take test acts where they have to take an oath of loyalty to the Christian religion. We even allow non-Christians to be in government. We need to understand what we are. We are a nation built on the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's different than being a Christian nation. Because a Judeo-Christian worldview is what gives us the understanding of religious liberty. It is what gives us the understanding that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with these rights. Buddhism does not give you that. Hinduism doesn't give you that because in Hinduism you're not even here. In Hinduism, you have to leave this plane of existence to get to reality. Islam does not give you that because in Islam not even all Muslims are created equal, much less all people. In Islam, if you don't convert, then you should die. Humanism, make no mistake, is a religion. And it doesn't give you that because in humanism, you are not created equal. You are the product of a cosmic accident out of inequality. It's the Judeo-Christian worldview that teaches that all men and women, and let me tell you, when I say all men, I mean that in the gender-neutral form, okay? All men will stand before God one day and answer for the things that they've done and have not done. Regardless of their profession of belief during life, every man will stand before God. And John Leland said, since every man must give an account of himself to God, and every man ought to be at liberty to serve God, and that way he can best reconcile it to his conscience. Let me mention to you, that liberty to serve God also implies that you have a liberty to not serve God. He says, if government can answer for individuals on that day of judgment, let men be controlled by it in religious matters, otherwise let men be free. Leland's simply saying, because we understand through the Judeo-Christian worldview that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess and every man will answer for their life. If the government can step up on that day and, push me aside and say, hey, pay no attention to Krisanne. I was president when Krisanne was living, and I realized she didn't live her life the way you wanted her to live it, but she was living the way I told her to live. And since she was just following the power that had been placed over her, pay no attention to what she did and take out her actions on me. How many of you think that's possible? It's not. Leland is saying on that day, since no man from government can stand before God on my behalf, then government cannot mandate your conscience. Leland's simply telling us, we have a God who hung the moon and the stars, who knows every hair on our head, knew us before we were in our mother's wombs, and he doesn't strike us dead the moment we don't believe what he wants us to believe. Therefore, government should never exercise a power greater than God exercises for himself. That's what religious liberty is. Understanding the sovereignty of God. Understanding who our master is and where our accountability lies. If you are a believer, you must remember Matthew chapter 6 clearly teaches you can't serve two masters. Romans 13 says the power of government is for the power of good. But when the power of government turns to a power for bad, you have to choose which master you're serving. Because you can't serve both. And if you follow government down the path of bad, government won't be able to stand with you when you stand before God. That is something you do on your own. That's why our forefathers said in the past, when your laws conflict with a higher law, they're no law at all. Because eternity means I stand before God. I don't stand before you. That's the history of our religious liberty. So how do we get to the point where we live in a place where all of that is forgotten? Where we can forget that the principle of separation of church and state means that government has no business in your church and has never meant that God has no place in public discourse. How do we get to the point where that separation of church and state is stretched so far out of recognition that we're even confused in the church what that means? First, I want to mention to you, we don't teach the Constitution in law school. How many of you realize that? No. We don't. And we haven't for quite some time. As a matter of fact, we probably haven't taught it properly since 1803. Maybe a little bit later. We teach constitutional law. Constitutional law teaches that judges and lawyers know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it. And then teaches us, lawyers and judges, how to circumvent the Constitution to get our argument. So now you know how a judge can take this letter from Thomas Jefferson in which he mentions that phrase, separation of church and state, and turn it into something it's not. Because we simply don't teach the truth anymore. The courts teach that Thomas Jefferson woke up one day with some random thought to sit down and write the Danbury Baptists. Only that's not true. That letter of separation of church and state to the Danbury Baptists in 1802 was the response to a letter that the Baptists had written him. See, Thomas Jefferson had just become President of the United States, and apparently the Danbury Baptists had been instrumental in getting him into office. So now they're going to write Jefferson a letter congratulating him on becoming President of the United States, and then just sort of giving him a little encouragement along the way. So we're so happy that you have been elected President of the United States, and we were so pleased to support you. This is the important part. Because of the stand that you took for religious liberty. And now that you're president, we just want to make sure that you're still going to take the same stand. We want to know if that office of the president has gone to your head. That would never happen, right? Thomas Jefferson wrote back and said, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. He was just simply remarking to the Danbury Baptists, I hear you. I appreciate your support, but I also want you to recognize that I know that I am just the President of the United States. And who am I to try to undo what the whole body of the people say so? And I know my history, and I know why we did it that way. So the big question that the courts should have been asking, and the ones that we should be asking in understanding separation of is not what does that mean, but what was that stand that Jefferson took to make the Danbury Baptists and those who supported Jefferson in this way actually support him? Well, the truth of the matter is this. Shortly after we ratified the Constitution, some legislators got together to put forward a bill called the Payment of Christian Teachers with Tax Dollars. Now remember, we pretty much believe the same thing throughout the colonies, pretty much. Richard Henry Lee said, "It is true, we are not disposed to differ much at present about religion. But when we are making a constitution, it is hoped for ages and millions yet unborn." Wow, did you catch that? How many of you remember the promise that our framers made at the end of the Declaration of Independence? Life, fortune, sacred honor. Our framers were willing to die for liberty. They were willing to go bankrupt for liberty. They were willing to sacrifice even their reputations for liberty. Not for themselves. For ages and millions yet unborn. Our framers believed the unborn were worth dying for. What do we believe about the unborn today? He said, "It is hoped for ages and millions yet unborn. Why not establish the free exercise of religion as a part of that national compact?" Now, Richard Henry Lee was speaking accurately, but we sometimes gloss over one of the most important words in that. We are not disposed to differ much. Which means what? They did differ, right? And Jefferson said to collect tax dollars to pay for Christian teachers, recognizing that we do differ within our belief systems. He said to force people to pay for things they do not believe in or may even abhor is sinful and tyrannical. He says it steals the liberty from the people to support the ministry of their choice and mandates a support of the ministry. If you take your tithes and offering and start delivering them through taxes, then if your pastor goes by the wayside and you no longer believe what he believes or he no longer believes what you believe, you can't withdraw your support from him. You are mandated by government law. And he said that's sinful and tyrannical. Well, the Danbury Baptists also agreed with Jefferson. Can you imagine the Danbury Baptists saying, "No, we don't want to pay Christian teachers with tax dollars"? How crazy is that? But they said, "It is believed to be repugnant to the spirit of the gospel for the legislature to proceed in matters of religion. Repugnant to the spirit of the gospel to pay teachers who would teach the gospel. How does that work? Well, let's think about that. Repugnant is a very strong word, referring to the spirit of the gospel's thoughts on paying Christian teachers with tax dollars. So what is the spirit of the gospel? The spirit of the gospel is very basically, through the fall of Adam, man inherited a sinful nature. And he created a gap between God and man that could never be reconciled by anything that we did. The Bible said no blood of bulls, no blood of goats could ever reconcile man back to God. So it took God in the form of his Son to come on this earth, live a perfect life, and suffer for our sins on the cross. Not what we do, but what he did on the cross, and faith in that alone is sufficient for our eternal salvation. So how would paying Christian teachers be repugnant to the spirit of the gospel? Well, it's the same thing that Jesus said to Nicodemus. Jesus said, if I teach you of earthly things and you believe me not, how will you ever believe me in the heavenly? Let me ask you, Christians, doesn't the Bible teach that we are to raise our children in the way that they shall go, and when they grow up they won't depart from it? It's actually Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it. Are we also not told to raise our children in the love and admonition of the Lord? That is actually Ephesians 6:4, but bring them up in the love and admonition of the Lord. But then aren't we taught that God so clothed the grass in the field, which is here today and gone tomorrow? Look at the sparrow. He doesn't toil or worry, and he has all that he needs. Look at the lily in the valley. Even Solomon in his day was never clothed in such an array. How much more will your Father in heaven provide for you, O ye of little faith? Matthew chapter 6 then goes on to say, therefore think not on what you shall wear and what you shall eat, because your Father in heaven knows what you need before you even ask of it. When you seek after these things, the Bible says, you seek after the things that the Gentiles seek after. In New Testament day, the Gentiles are the non-believers. And God's saying, when you worry about how you're going to provide for the ways to live when you're living in God's way, you look like a non-believer and I don't even recognize you to be my child. And then the Bible goes on and says, therefore, seek ye first the government and their benefits, and all these things will be added unto you. Is that what it says? No. It says, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Because everybody knows government has no righteousness. And all these things will be added unto you. But the Baptists were saying, and Jefferson was saying, that when we look to the government to provide the means to pay for our teachers, when our teachers are supposed to be training them in the ways of God, what we're saying is that God is insufficient to meet our earthly needs, and he needs a government bailout. And so when we bring the gospel to non-believers, and we walk in the way of unbelief, and we teach them that God is insufficient to meet our earthly needs, how can they ever believe that God alone is sufficient to meet our heavenly needs? They can't. St. Francis of Assisi said, every pastor should walk his sermon. Because if they don't see it in you, you're just a hypocrite. They also said, should the legislature assume the right of taxing the people for the support of the gospel, it would be destructive to religious liberty. Now, let's look into this a little bit closer, because the first idea is, if we pay the Christian teacher teachers with tax dollars, then they'll be able to keep our Christian schools open, and they'll be able to teach the gospel, which teaches liberty, and we will actually preserve liberty by paying our Christian teachers who will teach the gospel. There's a problem with that, though. Because when you pay somebody with tax dollars, who becomes their employer? The government. I mean, we like to think that we employ them, but to be honest, when the IRS gets their paycheck, do they call themselves employees of the people? No. When your government school teachers get their paychecks, do they call themselves employees of the people? No, state, county, city employees. And they said, those whom the government employs in its service, it has a right to regulate and dictate to. It will may soon then judge and determine who shall preach, when and where, and what they shall preach. Because when you pay Christian teachers with tax dollars, they said you make them government employees, and then the government will dictate to those teachers what they can and cannot teach, who they can and cannot teach, and who can do the teaching. And the next thing you know, all you have are government schools, which cannot teach liberty, because liberty and government are enemies. The government schools can't teach God, by the way, because if you teach the God of the Bible, then you teach you can't serve two masters. And what government school is going to teach your children that they must forsake government in the name of God? I mean, that's just common sense. So let me challenge you one more time before we go. This is why Christians cannot support, cannot endorse, and cannot accept vouchers. Vouchers are the payment of Christian teachers with tax dollars. They are repugnant to the spirit of the gospel. They declare that God is insufficient to meet our earthly needs, and he needs a government bailout. Now that's hard. My husband always says, easy preaching, hard living. That's hard to understand. I had one lady get angry with me and say, Krisanne, you are telling us that you are against school choice. I said, no, I'm not. I'm trying to keep it. We don't lack school choice in America. You can send your child to a government school if you choose. You can send your child to a private school if you choose. You can even homeschool your children in America. This is not Germany where you go to prison for homeschooling your children. We don't lack school choice in America. We lack parental priorities. We have Christian parents who believe it's more important to live in a three-bedroom, two-bath house in an affluent neighborhood with a 3-car garage and 2 cars in the driveway, a flat-screen TV in every room, a cell phone in every hand, and who likes to eat at home every night, and let's not forget that 11th commandment, thou shalt have a vacation every year. And we have Christian parents who have stopped believing that God will provide for their needs because they've started asking for things that God doesn't want them to have. They've put their faith in wood, hay, and stubble and the things of the world instead of stepping out and trusting God to provide for their needs. God does not need a government bailout. Last time I checked, the Bible says he has the cattle on 1,000 hills. And he knows what you need before you even ask. But he says, when you seek after these things, you should be seeking after the will of God. And then he will give you the delights of your heart. Why? Because then your heart's like God's heart, right? We need to get the proper education so that we can get the proper perspective, so we know what liberty is and what we should be standing for and how we should be standing. Hey, let me tell you something. This is what we're seeing in America is not a battle between Republicans and Democrats. This is not a battle between conservatives and liberals. This is a battle between good and evil. This is a kingdom battle. And Joshua says, you've got to choose you this day whom you are going to serve. kingdom of God or the kingdom of man, because you can't serve both of them. And that's what our framers knew, that we had to believe that God was sufficient to meet for our needs and look to him to be as a provider. And that when the laws of man conflict with the higher law of God, they are no law at all. Which is why this marriage thing should be a no-brainer. This is a state issue, not a federal issue. It's very, very clear. The problem is, here's the bad news. We, the Christians, have muddied up the water. Because you see, you remember, we asked the federal government to define marriage for us. Through the Defense of Marriage Act, we asked the federal government to do a job we never delegated to them to do. Now, the government's never going to argue with you about that. Oh, you want us to have that power over you? Oh, sure, we'd love to have that power over you. When was the last time you saw the government ever take a power and then give it back? Not without a fight. Why? Because of our ignorance. We've forgotten what liberty is. And we forgot where it came from. Samuel Adams said, "No people will tamely surrender their liberties when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved." He said, "But to the contrary, when a people become universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, they will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders." We may have an ISIS problem. We may have a government problem. But I believe, in my humble opinion, America's greatest problem is that we've become universally ignorant. And that's why I do what I do. And that's why the Catholics for freedom of religion do what they do. And that's why Christians everywhere should take a stand for liberty in the name of faith in the right kingdom. How many of you realize we're not teaching these things to our children? That's why I have these two books. This purple book is for high school and middle school students that teaches that 700 years, those 5 liberty charters, how we got these liberties as a part of our Constitution. Giving glory to God for helping America become an exceptional place. Not only that, there are chapters on framers and founders that you don't get to read about, like John Leland, Richard Henry Lee, James Otis Jr. How many of you heard of Penelope Barker? Mercy Otis Warren, Hannah Winthrop. How about Crispus Attucks? Anybody heard of Crispus Attucks?
Yeah.
Ned Hector, Peter Salem. These people are essential to the liberty that we have, and without them we would not be sitting here today. And our kids don't even know their names. The Blue Book is the same manuscript, but is geared for everyone younger, specifically geared towards non-readers. It is colorful. There are pictures. Each chapter has a poem in it, so your non-reader can memorize the poem like a memory verse in the Bible, and they will have learned what they needed to learn in the chapter. I have moms and dads contact me from all over the country telling me that their 2- and 3- or 4-year-olds have memorized every poem in this book. You know why? Because we underestimate what they can do. Because our kids will be as lazy as we let them. Wouldn't you? I teach a 5-hour workshop on Saturdays all over the country, where I go through the history of the Constitution that I taught you, but in greater detail. And then I walk through the Bill of Rights 1 through 10, and I show you where they came from, what they mean, how we got them in our Constitution. How many of you think we're doing it right? We're not. But I'll also show you how to get right. And I have this 5-hour workshop on this DVD set. There are 3 DVDs in each box, almost 6 hours of training, chaptered out in 40-minute chapters so you don't have to sit and watch the whole thing all at one time. I also have these books. These are our adult books, Volume 1, Volume 2, basically. This one, Liberty First, The Path to Restoring America. Remember those 5 liberties that we talked about in the First Amendment? Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to assemble, and
Redress the government.
the right to redress the government, petition the government for a redress of your grievances. I lost count. I didn't know if I was on 3 or 4. Okay. So,
I guess we were.
this is Constitutional Activism 101. How do you start exercising your rights to start securing your rights? We need to be more comfortable about exercising our rights and less comfortable about being politically correct. Being politically correct should make us uncomfortable. Do you know why? Because what they're saying is exercising your rights makes you uncomfortable when you're politically correct. And exercising your rights are only uncomfortable to 2 classes of people: tyrants and slaves. When we run around being politically correct, joyfully politically correct, what we're admitting is we're happy slaves. This book will help you understand why marriage is not a federal issue, among other things. How many of you, through our brief little history lesson, saw the way we're repeating some of that history? Okay. History always repeats. Our framers invented nothing. They learned from that history, so it should not surprise us to know that our framers anticipated the federal government that we have today. They believed, they hoped it would not be true, but they believed at some point in time we might become pacified in our prosperity, lazy in our luxury, and within our constitutional republic they designed a solution to that problem. It's right there in front of our faces. The problem is, we have failed to teach the truth for so long, it might as well not even exist at all. That's why I wrote this book. This is not an opinion-based book. This is a fact-based book. What this does is it gives you that plan that the framers designed in the Constitutional Republic in modern terms that's easy to understand. Not only that, the back part of the book is nothing but citations. Every quote, every document referenced is cited back to its original source document. So you can see whether I'm taking these quotes out of context or not, and you can see their proper application, because I don't ever want you to believe everything that I tell you. I'm not here to give you words to regurgitate. Because if all we do is stand up and repeat what somebody else has said, then we will be defeated in every time we stand. And you won't have the courage to stand either. I want you to have these tools to help restore liberty and have the courage to stand. This, by the way, is a lesson that I have taught to legislators and sheriff's deputies. I have taught the legislators of the state of Utah, Arizona, Kansas, and Oregon. And I figure if I can teach in Oregon, I should be able to teach in New York. I have taught sheriff deputies across the country. As a matter of fact, my lesson to sheriff deputies has been approved by the state of Texas as 4 hours of continuing educational credit. How many of you can think of at least 3 people who should have been sitting next to you today? I have lessons that I teach to middle school, high school students, to college students. I have this lesson that I teach in churches. I have another lesson that I teach in churches that is even biblically deeper. We go into greater scripture readings. I have a lesson that I teach on the Second Amendment. I have another lesson on the Second Amendment that goes into the Fourth Amendment as well, called America Disarmed. I have a lesson that I teach on the 9th and 10th Amendments. It's an adaptation of the ones that I teach the legislators, the constitutional role of every oath taker and every citizen. I have the 5-hour workshops. You can invite me back to speak to your groups. I will speak to any group. I have never turned anyone down. I even debated a liberal law professor in Miami. And I've spoken to bar associations. I think they're probably my most hostile crowd. And it won't cost you a dime to ask me to come and teach. I have no speaking fees. I don't make any group compensate me for travel or accommodations. We are not a fame ministry. We are a faith ministry. We believed 5 years ago that God laid a message on our heart, this message of His liberty as a gift to the people and our duty to stand for it. And we believe that God giving that message on our heart means that we should work for His kingdom. He has given us a talent to write these books. He has given us a talent to teach. And He's laid it on the hearts of people to help us generously through donations. We have people that support us like they do foreign missionaries. There's a group in Birmingham. They've dubbed me a missionary to the people of the United States in defense of the Constitution. Any of you ever been to Caritas? How many of you read They Fired a First Shot? I am not Catholic. I hope you won't hold that against me. But I have read that book, and I think every American should read it. It is an amazing, amazing book, and the parallels are some of the same parallels that I teach, and they never even knew who I was, and I didn't know who they were. Why? Because the Holy Spirit has a lesson for us to learn, and He's giving it to many people to teach it. I want to thank St. Bernard's for bringing me in. I want to thank Catholics for Freedom of Religion. I want to thank Barbara for being my dear friend above and everything. I have a radio show that I do 6 days a week, and I have Barbara as my guest on the show. If you go to my website, which is krisannehall.com, you can see all my archived radio shows. There are almost 400 of them. But you can also see the interview that I did with Miss Barbara. It's called, What Can One Person Do? Because Barbara is an unstoppable force all by herself for liberty.
Yes.
Now I want to mention to you something. Barbara is no superhero. She does not have superhuman strength, nor does she have and I don't either. We don't have grants from the Koch brothers. And we are not neither of us independently wealthy. We haven't figured out how to make more than 24 hours in a day, but I'm sure once Barbara figures it out, she'll let me know. I want you to realize that what she does, what the other 2 ladies do that work with her, what I do, you can do too. Because all it takes is a little bit of education, a little bit of courage, and a little bit of faith. Because if God be with us, who can be against us?